All right, this is going to be a new series on operational excellence. And the reason I decided to do this series is because of the proposed merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. And that proposed merger involves a key player by the name of Jim Vena, who is now the Union Pacific CEO. And the materials that we're going to be reviewing under the operational excellence series date back to the days when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and a little past that when Jim Vena was still the Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. In previous videos that I have made and posted, either on the UP-NS Merger YouTube channel or on the Rail Families United channel, I discuss a Mackyard incident which happened in 2007. And that was at a time when Keith Creel was actually the Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. But that incident outside of Toronto, in one of CN's largest yards, absolutely revealed that even back then in 2007, there was fake qualifications going on for frontline rail workers. And because of that Mackyard incident, and it was discussed in the Railway Investigation Report R07T0270, because of that incident, the Minister of Transportation at the time, a guy by the name, I believe, of the name of Lawrence Cannon, wrote a Railway Safety Act Section 19 order, ordering all Class 1 rail carriers operating in Canada to basically completely overhaul their training programs for frontline rail workers. Now, as part of the R07T0270 investigation report by the Transportation Safety Board, this evaluation form, and it's only a sample evaluation form because supposedly rail workers are supposed to be evaluated on 65 different skills in order to become qualified conductors. And this is the sample evaluation form which had been provided in the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to the Mackyard Rail incident. Now, that incident happened in 2007. In previous videos that I've shown you, via information that I obtained via Freedom of Information, there was a document in there that CN had provided to Transport Canada and the health and safety officer investigating the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, basically saying that they had not significantly overhauled their training programs since they were first filed. And that document was dated 2004. And I had requested changes to training programs, etc., and whether or not they had been approved by Transport Canada as the law would require. And that law is the Railway Safety Act. In other videos, I mentioned sections 18 and 19. Those have to do with a ministerial order, as had happened in the Mackyard incident. But section 20 has to do with training programs and changes to training programs that are initiated by rail carriers themselves. And they must go through the same. You need to first file them with the Minister of Transportation for prior review and approval prior to those programs being changed and implemented in the field. The Railway Safety Act overrides the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which is only a regulation. An act overrides a regulation. In the regulation, section 19, it only states that rail carriers just need to file within 90 days of the change. They need to file with Transport Canada advising them that the change to training programs has happened in the field. That does not mean that all they need to do is file within 90 days any changes to training programs. That's what the regulation says. The Act, the Railway Safety Act, Section 20, overrides the regulation. And that Act, Section 20, specifically states that changes to training programs for frontline rail workers must first be filed with Transport Canada for review and approval prior to field implementation. And there's no way that executives in the rail industry, with all their highly paid lawyers, and these people have been in the rail industry for decades, would not know the laws under which they must operate. So if you look here at this sample evaluation form, and again, per CN, when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed and I requested all this information pertaining to that death in 2013, which is when Jim Venna was Chief Operations Officer, one of the documents I was provided was a letter from CN Rail to regulators basically saying we're in compliance, we haven't changed our training programs since they were basically first filed, that we haven't changed them significantly. And you're going to see that that is absolutely not the case in all the other videos that I provide and whatever, as we go through all these materials pertaining to operational excellence and to deadly training materials and on, and the analysis of the railway or the Transportation Safety Board report into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. That was a report entitled R13W0260. So just to give you an idea here of what workers are evaluated on, there's if I go off screen here, it's because I'm legally blind in one eye. So if I have to read my screen, I have to get a little bit closer in order to read it. But they have pre-shift, then they have belt pack, they have riding equipment, train handling. Let's see, the next one is using air. Then we have radio operations, coupling and uncoupling, hand handbrakes, switches, point protection, hand signals, safety, and general. If you look at the list of stuff here, there's something very important that is missing. And if I'm doing this video today, I'm doing this one for track workers. I started, since I started these channels, I thought, okay, how am I going to promote my channel, talk to rail workers? I decided to do a bunch of business cards, had them printed, and I literally, this week, on Friday, went to a rail yard. And there just happened to be about a dozen track maintenance guys out there. And I just started talking to them. And, a woman shows up in the rail yard. There's not a lot of women in the rail industry. So they all kind of gathered around. And I was telling them that these YouTube channels are coming out and that if you're track maintenance workers, you need to be aware of these issues. Now, these were contractors. They were not CN employees. So I said, okay, do you only work in this area? And they said, no, we go all over. So I said, great, let other people know about these channels and about these issues. But as I was there talking to them, and I'm telling them about, how they're assuming that the people in the locomotive, the engineer and the conductor, are properly qualified. In other words, they haven't been fake qualified. They haven't had, only part of the training they should have had, and so on and so on. So when a train comes barreling down the track at them and, somebody forgot the foreman's limits, or these trains are coming down the track too fast, when there's work crews out there, the one guy chimes in and he goes, happens all the time. And you're going to see how easy mistakes are made, and they can be deadly and very costly mistakes when it comes to frontline rail workers. But anyway, one of the things that's clearly missing here is the testing of trainees, be they conductor trainees or locomotive engineer trainees, on how to read the work instructions, the paperwork that they print off and that they have in the locomotive. If they're a relief crew, the paperwork may already be in the locomotive. So how to properly read that paperwork. And we're going to go some of the issues here because that is a glaring omission in what should be PMRC'd when there are trainees being trained. PMRC means procedures, monitoring for regulatory compliance. And if these people as trainees, be they conductor trainees or locomotive engineer trainees, are not being PMRC'd and checked and tested in this critical area of reading the work, the paperwork tied to the work for the day, that's a huge gap that Transport Canada and rail carriers need to fix, and they need to fix it right away. All right, what you have here is an email which I sent out. It was actually in May 13th, 2018. Jim Venna had already left CN Rail by this time. However, the locomotive engineer who was at the controls training my child, who was a locomotive engineer trainee on this particular day, to become a locomotive engineer, you at CN Rail, the procedure is you basically first have to be a conductor, first the conductor trainee, then a conductor, and then you work your way up to locomotive engineer trainee and then locomotive engineer. So this person, if you have to go through all those steps, would have been at CN Rail in those other roles, locomotive engineer trainee or conductor or conductor trainee prior to working his way up to a locomotive engineer. And that takes more than 2 years. You have to be a conductor, a qualified conductor, usually for at least 2 years before they put you into the locomotive engineer training program. Um, for so in the case of my child, it had been even longer than that. I think it had been over 3 years before my child was put into that program. And so my point is only that the locomotive engineer, who absolutely also played a role here, would have been trained under Jim Venna when he was the operations officer at CN Rail. The qualified conductor that was in the engine that day, he was a newly qualified conductor. And my child was a locomotive engineer trainee. So after this particular incident happened, I documented it in 2018 with regulators in Canada. It went to Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, who was the leader of the opposition at the time, and most of the provincial premiers. Marc Garneau was the Minister of Transportation. It went to the Governor General's office. Ralph Goodale was in charge. He was the Minister of Public Safety. It went to the Minister of Justice, the Auditor General of Canada, Ontario. Lisa Raitt was the former Minister of Transportation. She's the one who signed off on the accident report for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. So I had documented this particular issue, which absolutely impacts frontline crews working on the tracks. So I told them, please read this one very carefully. And where I blanked out certain names or whatever, that is because it's too much of an identifying thing, and so I had to remove it. But I can still read this in order to make the point. So it says, please read this one very carefully. It shows how simple problems and mistakes can have devastating consequences for locomotive crews and rail maintenance crews working on the rail lines, as well as anyone working in foreman's limits. Another priceless lesson, to be sure. This lesson, and I would always put lessons, and then my name or my city name or whatever, when I talked to regulators, and I sent them a lot of these lessons emails. It has to do with the importance of paperwork on rail lines and how simple mistakes can lead to catastrophes. And this lesson may help explain some of those many questions regulators so often have when they say, we don't know why the train was moving so fast when it should have been going much slower. So your lesson for today. I said, as you know, and then it's my child is now in on again, off again, CN, rail, locomotive engineer training. And they had completed the coursework, and then I give the date. But due to needs of the business, engineer training had been very sporadic. That's also another issue. You start locomotive engineer training, then, they lay off a bunch of conductors, you're booted back down to conductor, uh, you know, and so the locomotive engineer training program could actually take much longer than it was supposed to. And so, you're supposed to remember what you've learned and then just pick up and keep going. Even if it could have been months and months since you were last in training. So that's an issue too. But anyways, and this was again happening under Jim Vena because, my child was a conductor trainee under Jim Vena and a qualified conductor under Jim Vena. And they started locomotive engineer training right after Jim Vena had left. So I said, as you know, my child is in the on and off again CN Rail engineer training. They completed their coursework on this time frame, and due to the needs of the business, engineer training has been very sporadic. The only reason I'm telling you this is to let you know that the error which happened in a locomotive on May, and then I give the date, on a train bound for this terminal, was an error caught by my child, not by the recently qualified conductor or the experienced engineer. Had my child not been on the train that day, well, see if at the end of this email you as regulators can count yourselves lucky that my child was there to catch an error having to do with the paperwork. And we're going to keep going. So we're going to continue. We ended with an error having to do with paperwork problems, easy to make human errors, and potentially disastrous consequences of poor paperwork printouts. Now, again, it's my child's name, was in the locomotive on this day preparing to leave. The engineer and the recently qualified conductor, with all that this implies, given conductor training issues, which I have raised with regulators over the past several years, well, just as pilots have to do checks before they leave, so do locomotive crews. The conductor, I believe, is usually the one in charge of the paperwork on the locomotive. He had his copy of the paperwork. And then my child, I'm thinking that the engineer may have used the copy of the conductor to review the work instructions for that day, but I have no way of knowing that. I don't know if my child had the only copy of the paperwork for the engineers, that if only one gets printed for the engineer and none for the trainee. I don't know those details, or whether or not each person in the locomotive has a copy of the paperwork. But even if each person has their own copy, let's say for argument's sake, that the locomotive engineer with a lot of experience on the rails put his copy aside and was looking at the conductor's copy, because something like that could definitely happen in a locomotive. The crew, all three of them, could go over the instructions using just one copy of one person, right? Now keep that point in mind as we go through this lesson of how simple mistakes can have potentially devastating consequences. The email goes on. So, as they were all preparing to leave, and again, there are other issues that would impact focus and attention to detail as a crew prepares to leave, as it has to do system checks, talk with rail traffic control or dispatch, watch for workers in the area while still in the yard, listen to what's going on in communications, coming on the radio, because there could be emergencies or something going on in the yard too. and on and on and on. And so attention to paperwork alone, well, it's just not a realistic situation in a locomotive as crews are preparing to leave. So keep that in mind too as we all go through this lesson pertaining to rail safety. So as my child's crew was preparing to leave, the engineer said to my child, and my child again was the engineer trainee, we have 3 slows, right? Meaning that there would be 3 times the train would have to slow down along the route, either for work crews, foreman's limits, whatever. So again, the email goes on. When there is a foreman's limit, that means there is usually a work crew or something going on out there, and the foreman owns the track. And the train cannot proceed without getting clearance from the foreman. At least that's my understanding of it. Clearance might come from the RTC, but clearance must come from someone. So the point to keep in mind here is that the foreman's limit is also something that can absolutely appear on paperwork of a locomotive crews to alert them to the fact that there's crews out there, along with slows. A slow could be, there might be some washouts in the area, proceed more slowly in certain areas. There could be different reasons for slows, meaning the crew has to slow down in specific areas. So the experienced engineer, and I am saying that only to show you that this absolutely happens, even with experienced locomotive engineers. And this person would have been a locomotive engineer qualified, and he was working under Jim Vena, prior to Jim Vena leaving. Jim Vena left, I think it was before July 2016. That's when Mike Corey became the new chief operations officer at CN Rail. And so Jim Vena would have left before July, I believe, of 2016. And so this locomotive engineer, if he was, I don't know how many years he had, but regardless, at one point, he was working under Jim Vena for at least 3 years. And so if you've got these kinds of operational issues at CN Rail, it's a huge issue when even your experienced locomotive engineers who are training locomotive engineer trainees have issues such as what you're going to see in this email. So the experienced engineer, and I'm saying that only to show you that this absolutely happens to even to experienced locomotive engineers, said to my child, who was the engineer trainee, who may or may not have been there that day. That crew actually lucked out that my child was there that day because the other 2 crew members did not catch the error. So keep that in mind too as we all go through this lesson, because CN and regulators can absolutely count their lucky stars that my child was in the locomotive that day. But see if you agree as you read on. The experienced engineer, just prior to leaving, tells my child, the engineer trainee, something to the effect of, so we have 3 slows, right? The recently qualified conductor was already in the locomotive with his paperwork, and he did not catch the error for a very good reason. When the experienced engineer said, so we have 3 slows, right? My child, who was the engineer trainee, who had already carefully reviewed the copy of the work instructions for the day, stated, no, we have 6 slows. The experienced engineer, if I recall the conversation with my child, then said, no, we only have 3. And my child said, no, we have 6. So there's another point there. I've always taught my child, have a lot of attention to detail and don't be afraid to push back when you need to. My child was a locomotive engineer trainee. If a locomotive engineer tells you we only have 3 slows, are you going to think maybe you read the paperwork wrong and not speak up? Because when my child said, no, we have 6, the locomotive engineer, who was experienced, came back and said, no, we only have 3. And so my child pushed back and said, no, we have 6. Would the average locomotive engineer trainee have pushed back? That's another issue that absolutely would need to be addressed in training, in PMRC situation, in testing frontline rail workers in these types of issues. And I can pretty well tell you that this type of testing and PMRC does not seem to be happening today. So the experienced engineer rechecked the paperwork after my child insisted there were 6 slows. So I'm not sure whose paperwork he checked, but that might be part of the issue too here. And sure enough, he then says to my child, the engineer trainee, you're right, we have 6. But it's the engineer trainee who may not have been there that day who caught the error. What if the error had not been caught and the crew took off on its merry way thinking they only had 3 slows when in fact they had 6? Would that explain trains that come barreling down on work crews when they're supposed to slow down, when there's foreman's limits or whatever? Absolutely. So how could the experienced engineer have missed 3 out of 6 slows on the paperwork? And how did the recently qualified conductor also miss 3 of the 6 slows on the paperwork? Because he didn't chime in either. And I'm pretty sure it's the qualified conductor who's supposed to oversee the paperwork in the locomotive. And so why didn't he chime in? Okay, and again, one of those slows could have been a foreman's limits. It wasn't in this case, but it most certainly could have been. So definitely keep that in mind as you also start to ponder the very serious consequences of having a locomotive crew potentially miss the 3 slows or further critical instructions for the day because my child might not have been there, especially given it can take a train, say about 2 miles to stop, depending on the train, the weight, the topography. So these are all huge issues. So how could the experienced locomotive engineer, who likely would have been trained under the days of Jim Vena, or have worked as an even more experienced, potentially, locomotive engineer under Jim Vena, potentially for 3 years under Jim Vena, and the conductor have missed so many critical instructions? That's a really good question. Don't you all agree? Let me now give you just one possible reason this potentially disastrous situation took place. It is something so simple that no one would ever think it could have such potentially devastating consequences, making it all the more reason that regulators need to act on this and not just let it slide and do nothing as regulators. Or as, if you're a rail executive and you're listening to this, you better get your butt in gear and fix some of these issues that are allowing this to happen. And that would mean PMRCing all rail workers on how to properly read work instructions for the day prior to leaving the yard or taking over as a relief crew. So the recently qualified conductor had paperwork that had been printed on double-sided printing instead of one-page sided printing only. His copy had 1 page in the wrong order. I don't know if he had dropped it or whatever, but the conductor's work instructions that day had 1 page out of order. And so it was facing the wrong way also. So you could have, a blank page or a couple of lines at the top, and it looks like you've got no other work instructions when there's work instructions on the back. So because it was a double-sided piece of paper. It was facing the wrong way. Now, I'm not sure where in this order the reversed page of instructions was found, but for argument's sake, let's say it happened towards the end of the trip instructions, at a time when, during a trip, a crew would also be exhausted and unlikely to catch errors that had already been missed in the locomotive at the start of the shift. Okay, and the email to regulators on this issue went on to state, so a page of instructions is reversed and in the wrong order. Now, what if that last page, the real last page, has only a few lines on it and a bunch of white space indicating end of instructions? Well, having such a page of instructions in the wrong order or reversed would make it such that a locomotive crew would mistakenly believe that there are no more instructions and or critical warnings for this trip, right? When in reality, there could have been a whole other page of critical instructions that was very easily missed because a crew member had instructions printed on double-sided paper and just one of those pages ended up in the wrong order. So regulators, the critical point number one you should all be seeing here is that all locomotive crew instructions should be printed on single-sided paper with big page numbers on them so that you don't also have to deal with software problems having to do with pages printed out of order or page numbers. The page numbers should be in big print on those instructions, and those instructions should be one-sided only. I used to work with programmers, and let me tell you, depending on the code, these types of mistakes as far as how the paper prints could also be an issue. Because it could be coding errors too that cause a page to print the wrong way or out of order. You never know, and that's why you need to do so much software testing uh, when it comes to issues like this. I used to do software testing, did it for years for a global 100 company, worked with up to 15 programmers a day. I know what I'm talking about. So I think we can all argue that going green in matters of saving paper for rail carriers is not something that, as the fact clearly shows, would be in the interest of the environment. Giving missing critical instructions can lead to massive derailments, which could involve dangerous goods and loss of life, right? Before I leave this issue here of the single-sided paper and, the need for big page numbers on all these work instructions, I'm going to give you a real life example of what I'm talking about. I used to have one of my programmers in Chicago. I used to oversee 3 in-house applications for a global 100 company, and I did the budgets also for my VP. But when I worked with programmers, one of my programmers, he was my guy to go to if I needed special reports run, either for the field or for myself, for management, whatever. And by the field, I mean I used to support over 500 salespeople with the work that I did. So um, I was in a group called Sales Support. And so worked with my VP, worked with the sales force, and worked with a lot of programmers. So if I went to one of my programmers and asked him to write a new report for me, he would code it, and then I would print it, test it, look at how it would print in the field, whatever. Okay? Let me give you a simple example. What if in his code it looked to him on the screen as though the page break was at a certain place, but let's say you had what's called an orphan and one line flipped to another page. Okay, well then, let's say it's towards the end. That now becomes my second last page. And what should have been the last page, or that page is now one page further. And so if I've got double-sided printing, and my one orphan line is at the top of that next page. And I'm printing on double-sided paper, and it just happens that the last page is flipped on the back of that one line. If you're a work crew reading those instructions and you've just got that one line and everything else is blank, you're very likely going to assume that that's the end of the work instructions, because there could have been a mistake in the coding of the report or how it printed out. Could have been an error with how the print margins were aligned, on the printer, or whatever, on whoever's printer is actually printing the instructions, if their margins are off. There's a lot of things that can cause something like this. So you could easily see how, if you're using double-sided paper, an error like this can happen, putting the lives potentially of lots of people working on the tracks at risk. And so mistakes like this, when it's safety critical issues, you can't allow this to happen. You have to do what you need to do as a rail carrier, as a regulator, to prevent these types of errors. And failure to do so, in my opinion, especially when these issues have been documented for you, is nothing short of criminal negligence. And so, if more and more people can keep getting killed, track crews, start requesting training, start requesting copies of work instructions, start requesting PMRCing of crews to see if regulators are doing what they should be doing in these issues. Because there are entirely too many trains that are running foreman's limits, going too fast where they should not be, etc., etc., etc. And when I met with these guys on Friday of this week, handing out my business cards, telling them about my YouTube channels, this work crew, and I'm telling them about these issues of, you want to make sure the people in the crew have been properly trained, because you don't want trains barreling down on you when you're working on the tracks. And I'm telling you, the one guy, he chimes in, happens all the time. Why is it happening all the time? Clearly, regulators and rail executives are not taking their responsibilities for those work crews seriously. When my child called to tell us about this trip that they had been on, and they were clearly very upset because there were rail maintenance crews all over the place that day. Dozens of rail maintenance workers, all of whom could have their lives at risk because of a simple printing problem and a mistake that is so easy to make with double-sided paper and a page that is reversed. As I have spent so many months looking into rail safety issues, and in 2018, I was by now looking at death investigation reports. I was just starting to look at the death investigation report for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And reading death investigation reports, it has always puzzled me that rail maintenance workers also often get killed. Why? I know they may not hear the train coming. A lot of people think you can hear the train. You can't. And that is a huge issue. But those crews would be under the very mistaken assumption that rail crews knew 100% that they were out there and that trains were supposed to slow down given it was on the paperwork, right? You've got all these work crews out there assuming that locomotive engineers and locomotive engineer trainees, conductors and conductor trainees have been properly trained by the likes of Jim Vena. And again, fake qualifications, didn't just happen when Jim Vena was Chief Operations Officer. They were clearly happening well before that, dating back as far as 2007 during the Mac Yard rail incident outside of Toronto at one of CN's largest yards. So my email went on. What if the error had not been caught that day and a train came barreling down the track, not once, but 3 times faster than it was supposed to, when there were dozens of work crews out there? Do you, as regulators, honestly think that maintenance crews out there on the lines would have been unscathed by a train that could be coming at them much faster than it was supposed to be, as they worked out there, focused on what they were doing, and under the wrong assumption that the locomotive crew knew they could be out there, and or the wrong assumption that the locomotive crew knew it was supposed to slow down? Not once, but in 3 separate times. All of them missed because one page was reversed in a work order printout. You know, the topography where these crews work, it's not all straight lines. It's not all. Actually, this incident happened in Saskatchewan. So you'd have more of a view. But again, it takes, it could take a mile or more for a train to stop. And if there's equipment on the track, that could absolutely hinder the view of the maintenance crew if the track maintenance equipment is between the locomotive that's coming barreling down at them and them. If the equipment is in the middle, they may not see the train coming, and they may get hit before they even realize the train is coming at them. So it's really time for rail carriers to come into the 21st century, when it comes to printouts for rail crews, and to PMRCing, procedures monitoring for regulatory compliance of the crews that are in the locomotive. I don't care if you've been a locomotive engineer for 30 years. If you miss this, you weren't properly trained. That's all I can say. There is no excuse for missing this type of stuff, even a reverse page. People need to be trained. They need to be tested in these types of scenarios where, yeah, I've got an orphan at the top of the page. There's more instructions on the back. But you shouldn't even have double-sided instructions. They should be one page printed out per page. You should not have double-sided. That to me just opens it up entirely too much for these types of errors. One page printed with a big page number at the bottom. Make sure the pages are consecutive and whatever. That's the only way to avoid these types of scenarios. Double-sided, in my opinion, is entirely too dangerous. So surely as regulators, you can see how such simple mistakes can be made and how they could lead to so much devastation in lives lost, industrial accidents, and on and on and on. And when work crews are saying happens all the time, it's a huge issue. Why are you not addressing it? All right, this little section here is an update to this video. When I do an update to a video, I'm going to make it very obvious. I'm going to obviously have different clothes on, but for my viewers, let's just agree that I will use this gold seal for my logo so that you can easily pick out new sections in a video. I don't want to be wasting your time. I know rail workers are exhausted as it is, so we're going to agree that if I have an update or something I need to communicate to you as a note to viewers, whatever, I'm going to be using this particular logo. That way you can just, advance through the video if you've already watched it and look for the update. It'll be very obvious to you where the update is in the video if you look for the gold seal, or the gold logo. So this update has to do with work instructions. After I raised these issues with regulators in Canada, CN seemed to go to an electronic tablet for locomotive crews. So if that's where the work instructions are, I know that when those came out, my child said everybody hates them. But were they, they may have gone to a training session and whatever, but if there's still this many trains that are, when the guy says happens all the time, that these trains come barreling down at them, there's still an issue. The coding is not what it needs to be if this is still happening all the time, which clearly it is, according to these track workers. So electronic, fine. Maybe it's great. Maybe it does away with the printing issues as far as double-sided printing. But rail carriers, you're still not there. You're still having too many issues, too many things being missed by the crews in the locomotive. They need to be, fine, they've been trained on how to use tablets, whatever. But it's still not there. Like, it needs to be better training, PMRCing, of how to actually look for the limits, the slows, all of that stuff, the foreman's limits, whatever. So maybe it's a great attempt to try and do away with the problems with pages, but it's not good enough. It's not working. Still too many trains running foreman limits or going too fast when they should be slowing down. So maybe it's a great attempt to try and do away with this issue, but you're not there. So take that criticism, rail executives and regulators, for what it is and do something about it. It is still not good enough. And that completes the end of this update, but there's more information after this little section, so keep watching the video. If you have not already done so as a rail worker or a frontline, not just the track workers, if you're a frontline rail worker, if you're a rail customer, a rail investor, whatever, if you have not already looked at the video entitled Railroad Workers Anthem by Brandon Petty, posted at this YouTube link, go on YouTube and look at that video. And you will see in there, where, listen to the beginning where they say how devastated the rail industry has become in the last 6 years, which just happens to coincide with when Canada started allowing a lot of these rail executives to escape to U.S. Class 1 rail carriers, but also to devastate or infest the U.S. rail industry, as I like to put it. But if you look in that video, there's a section there where the guy sings, "But I'm young and work real fast." And there is a train that is barreling down on a track maintenance crew. That is exactly what this video and these issues are about. And, actually it's kind of funny because, well, not funny, but sad, because one of the other people that I spoke to this last Friday when I was talking to all these track maintenance guys, that's exactly what one of them said when I was talking to them about these trains barreling down on them. He goes, "You just learn to run faster," or he made some kind of comment to that effect. That's not the solution. Regulators, rail carriers, the issues have been documented. So, if rail workers on the tracks keep dying, I hope you face class action lawsuits if these issues don't get addressed, because they're obviously not being taken seriously. And when you look at this video, Railroad Workers Anthem, people are looking at that, and most people wouldn't even probably catch, like if you're not a railroader, people probably wouldn't even realize what's going on. Well, they see these guys are running off the tracks, but they're not understanding. Foreman's limits are being run. Somebody didn't read the work instructions properly. They didn't know to slow down. These crews don't just appear out of the middle of nowhere onto a track. That's scheduled work. And it's part of the instructions that all the train crews get. So what you're seeing there, why is it if every locomotive pretty well would have two people? There are some rail carriers that are moving to one member crews. I would seriously argue against that for issues like this too, even more. But most carriers probably have crews of two people. And so if this is happening all the time, that means you've got, at minimum, where there's two-person crews, both the conductor and the locomotive engineer are missing these issues. So clearly, proper training and testing in these matters is still not happening. Happens all the time. Well, work crews, the issue again has been documented. It's been documented in Canada for sure with regulators. And I'll be posting this in matters of operational excellence on the UP-NS merger YouTube channel also. And I'll be advising regulators in the US about that channel, including the Surface Transportation Board. So you can't say the issue's not been documented. And this operational excellence has been going on a long time, including under the likes of Jim Vena. It was never addressed. And so, do we really want the operational excellence of so many of these former CN rail executives who've now escaped to Class 1 U.S. rail carriers? Because Claude Mongeau was another one, and he became chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern. This was happening under him too. It was also happening under Keith Creel, who was chief operations officer when they had the Mackyard incident, which was showing fake qualifications of frontline rail workers. And we're going to get into all of those issues too. But this first video on operational excellence, I'm dedicating to the guys that I spoke to this past Friday, as I gave them the first business cards to be handed out to rail workers and said, pass this along, let others know about this channel. So this one is for track workers. I'll likely be doing more on the issue of track maintenance and issues with all of that. But when I heard that one guy chime in, happens all the time. He's telling me that in August of 2025. Clearly the issues have not been addressed, and they need to be. So this one's for you guys, and on that, have a great day, and I will see you on the next one.